Welcome to Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So Happy New Year to all of our listeners. And with the new year comes new laws. So it looks like we've got about 1,000 new laws in California alone. And hey, Tim, why don't you start off with your top three of the laws that you're following?
Well, I think, I think we have written before on our blog, there's always the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, in California, it's usually the ugly, the uglier, and the ugliest. But a few laws that I'm following that I think are interesting. One of them is AB 257, and it's called the Fast Recovery Act. And our Kerry Jackson has written about this extensively. And basically, it creates a state council with appointees from the governor and the legislative leaders to basically kind of set rules for fast food franchises in California. And basically, it's viewed as a backdoor not only to unionization of fast food franchises, but also that it could lead to, these state appointees setting a $25 minimum wage, a $30 minimum wage, who knows? Now, we know, of course, the impact of this will be a lot of franchises may close their doors, move to other states. You'd have a lot of people who may not have a great educational background and who, working at a fast food franchise is their livelihood, may be denied those opportunities. So the restaurant industry has gone out and gotten over 1 million signatures to qualify that law for a referendum. But one of the interesting things, and this happened over the Christmas break, is that law was going to take effect January 1st, as nearly all new laws do. But the Secretary of State had not ruled yet whether the law had enough valid signatures for to go on the ballot. So that law was going to take effect January 1st, barring legal action or action by the Secretary of State. So the restaurant industry went to court, and a judge has put the law on hold now until January 13th, when there'll be a hearing on the issue. And the Secretary of State says they will have a ruling on how many valid signatures there are sometime toward the end of January. So it seems like we're headed toward this law being put on hold, barring a vote of the people. But, it's uncertain if the judge says, no, the law can go forward. It is uncertain, in that 2 or 3 weeks of enforcement, what will happen there. So that's certainly one that's, I don't know if that's uglier or ugliest that I'm watching.
Right.
Ro, what's one of your picks?
Well, Tim, I've got a good law here, and it's a rose among 1,000 thorns. I like that jaywalking law that was finally lifted. I don't have a car, as you know. I walk to work. I walk everywhere. There's hardly any cars on the streets of Pasadena in the morning. So I'm glad that I don't have to wait for the ridiculously long walk signals. So I think this is a little gem in 1,000 laws that the legislature passed.
But Ro, I agree with you on that. I mean, I think it makes, we all jaywalk every day, and it certainly makes no sense, to have that policy in place. And when you're talking about real issues with, kind of weak criminal justice laws, going back on our tough on crime public safety laws that are having a real difference in increasing victimization in California, makes no sense to have, that policy on the books. So a rare good law that the legislature passed. Well, another law that I've been following is SB 1137, and that's a law that would require a 1,200-foot space between oil and gas wells in community areas. Now, environmentalists have been pushing this, and they say it'll reduce the impact of leaking wells and pollution from oil production. But the real issue here is that law is going to devastate oil production in California, that we're already experiencing high prices at the pump. We pay more than every other state because of these California-only laws. And that law would have a real issue of having available gas supply because, we have California-only blends of gasoline. Now, that's another one where a referendum could help to block that law for a while. The California Independent Petroleum Association went out and collected signatures, and they submitted those signatures in December. So we're waiting to see, what happens there. But that could be another one where we'll have the review sometime in January, and ultimately the voters will decide. Ro, what's another law that you're following?
Well, Tim, and I've written about this before, this ridiculous pink tax law says that businesses can't charge more for products that are, quote, substantially similar if they're sold to females. And Tim, this is just another example of government getting in the way of the free market. There's more to pricing a product than the cost of manufacturing a product. There's supply and demand for one, and you would frankly have to spend a lot more money to market, say, a pink lawnmower to me than a blue lawnmower to you. So there's a lot more cost, and this is just a ridiculously simplistic way of enforcing the government's idea of what's fair. And then I wonder what happens with haircuts, odd things like that. And the secret is that I have a big mop of curly, messy hair, and I spend a small fortune having it thinned out and straightened. And Tim, if you wanted to do the same thing, but you have very nice hair, so you don't have to worry, I wonder what the salon would charge you versus me. The whole thing is ridiculous.
Well, I actually kind of half learned how to cut my own hair during COVID, and I have not been back to the barber since. So my investment in my clippers and scissors has more than paid off. But you're right. I mean, it is another just silly law. And you wonder too, are these solutions in search of a problem too? Another law that I'm following that I think is an interesting one, and actually another could be, in a good way, is this the effort by the legislature last year to kind of chip away at the CEQA requirements that we identified in our CEQA Gauntlet study last year, that are holding up the construction of new housing projects and a whole bunch of other priorities aside from housing. So there is a new law that was signed, the Affordable Housing and High Road Jobs Act, that basically eased where areas that are zoned for parking and retail and office that could also be used for housing, and it has some streamlining and speeding up of these myriad review processes and bureaucracies that hold up approval of these projects and make them more expensive. So the supporters of this bill estimate that there could be 108,000 acres of land newly open for home construction, which could pave the way for between 1.5 and 2.5 million homes. Now, they also say only 200 to 300,000 of those would not require a government subsidy. Well, maybe we need to work on that now. We shouldn't be subsidizing home construction in the first place, but seems like a step in the right direction, and we'll be watching that one in the new year.
Well, Tim, I wanted to comment on what you said, and we're actually working on a new study this year that's going to build from some of the reforms that the legislature passed, including this law. So what more can we do to advance reforming the California Environmental Quality Act? And as you mentioned, that one about the 200,000 to 300,000 homes that are not subsidized. How odd is that? Does that mean the other 800,000 other homes are subsidized? That took me aback when I read that. So I've got one more ugly law. I think this is probably one of the ugliest laws ever. And that would be the increase once again of the minimum wage to $15.50. Now, in 2022, the minimum wage in the state was $14 an hour for employers with 25 or fewer employees, and $15 an hour for employers with more than 25 employees. So this is really going to hit small business hard, especially at a time when a lot of economists are forecasting a recession this year. So it's an ugly law. I feel for the small businesses with all of these laws that are really putting them under siege. And we're just going to have to just pray that they hang on and stay in California and thrive.
That's right. I mean, this is the worst time for this to take effect. And really, you just question. It was interesting. Politico had an article that came out over the Christmas week saying that Gavin Newsom was a, quote, moderate. Well, maybe in the farthest left part of the states, Gavin Newsom is a moderate, but this is a guy who's theoretically a small business owner and someone who understands the concerns of business and entrepreneurship. And yet he allowed this minimum wage to go through in some of, the toughest economic times we've seen in a long time in California. So hate to see, what the impact of this law will be.
We're going to move on to our guest, a special guest, Steve Hilton. Many of you know that he is a host on Fox, but many of you don't know that he's actually a Californian and has a podcast called The Daily California, which we encourage everyone to listen. And there's also another neat little fact, actually, about Steve Hilton. He's kind of part of the PRI family because his wife, Rachel Whetstone, is the granddaughter of PRI's founder, Sir Anthony Fisher. This is a recording of luncheon we had in Newport Beach, and we thought it would be great to showcase it here, especially for our Northern California listeners who weren't able to attend the Newport Beach lunch. So we think you'll enjoy this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Ronia. Great to be here. As you say, it's like being home, both in terms of being here in California and, of course, being here to join you all with PRI, which has been such a part of our family. I have to say, though, I'm relieved it's Southern California. There's a particular vibe, as we all know, that goes with Southern California, which I greatly appreciate. As you can see, I'm kind of a relaxed kind of person, don't like to dress up, so I was a little bit concerned. Every time I walk into a venue and you see a big sign on the wall, as you do here, dress code will be strictly enforced, I always think, uh-oh, that's me out. They're not going to let me in. But it's Southern California, and everything's okay, and I can see that I'm not the only person here not wearing a tie, so that's very encouraging. In fact, as was mentioned, I worked in 10 Downing Street in the UK before moving here, and became well known for my very relaxed dress sense there. There wasn't even a jacket in sight when I worked at 10 Downing Street. And the press used to take pictures of me. They delighted in taking pictures of me arriving for work every morning on my bike, because I used to cycle around, because the traffic in London is terrible. It's a small city. Getting around on a bike works very well. And I just couldn't believe it. Literally, if you go on the internet and you Google Steve Hilton bike, I promise you, you will find endless photographs, almost exactly the same angle, but me in different states of dishevelment in very old T-shirts and shorts, looking rather the worse for wear. So it's wonderful to be here. I made an effort. I'm wearing a jacket. I hope you appreciate that. As Sally mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the UK. I'll also talk a little bit about the midterms and what we are to make of that. And I'm going to end by talking about California, which is my great love. I'm a proud American now, as you mentioned. That was last year. We moved here 10 years ago, and so I'm very proud now to be here for good and try and make things better, particularly here in California. So I want to spend some time on that. But before we do any of that, I do just want to say a word about PRI and about my education in the incredibly valuable and important principles that PRI stands for and works for and fights for, which literally happened at the kitchen table of Linda Whetstone, the daughter of PRI's founder, Sir Anthony Fisher. Linda, my mother-in-law, it's still slightly difficult for me to say was my mother-in-law. She sadly died almost a year ago. But the thing I'd like to mention is actually a more joyful experience involving Linda Whetstone, my former mother-in-law, which was just the other week in New York. She actually died in a way in the best possible circumstances you can imagine. She was chair of the Atlas. Is it the Atlas Institute or Foundation?
It used to be Atlas Economic Research Foundation.
Right.
Now it's just the Atlas Foundation.
The Atlas Foundation, which is an amazing organization that I think also Sir Anthony started that, which brings together organizations like PRI, those fighting for the principles of freedom and free markets and liberty around the world. It's an amazing organization. She happened to be chair of that, and they had their annual Liberty Forum going on last year in Miami, Florida. And it was an amazing day. I'll tell the story because it's amazing, and I want you to hear this as in a positive sense, because that's certainly how I and my wife and the family think of it now, having had a year to reflect on this nearly. She was there with all the amazing people from around the world that Atlas brings together fighting for freedom, and she was up the night before she died dancing the conga in the ballroom with all these people from all over the world, freedom fighters from all over the world, having an incredibly happy time. And the next morning, over breakfast, literally, like that, suffered an aneurysm and literally dropped dead at the height of her powers, and amongst the people that she loved, that loved her, doing what she loved best. And so we think of that in a very positive way. And the event this year, that exact same event, was held this year in New York a couple of weeks ago. And we all went along, me and my wife and Linda's husband, Francis Whetstone, my father-in-law, and a few of our other family members. We all went to New York because they organized a wonderful tribute to Linda. And the thing that I just want to say is you can't help but be inspired by the incredible work that everyone around the world who is doing that hard work of fighting for freedom in difficult circumstances, whether that is people in Africa or across Asia. There are people from all over the world, South America, but also from here in America. And in different ways, it's really hard. It can be really hard to fight for freedom. It's a different set of obstacles that you face if you're trying to do that in Afghanistan, which was one of the last projects that Linda Whetstone really threw herself into. That's a very different set of barriers to freedom than we face here, but it's still a barrier. We face real barriers, and we'll probably talk about some of them today in trying to advance the cause of liberty and freedom. And it's that same energy and passion and determination and perseverance. That's the big point I wanted to leave you with. It's this perseverance. You've got to keep at it. That was one of Linda's great lessons for me, and that's what PRI is doing here. Because here in America, particularly in California, we know it's an uphill struggle. But the fact that PRI is here and keeps fighting and keeps persevering, and you just don't know what the impact will be. You don't know who picked up that pamphlet or saw something online or talked to someone who'd been at an event. It's a really incredibly important work that is done by PRI. So I just wanted to say I'm really happy to see you all here. And for those of you who haven't been involved, I do urge you to get involved, because it's not going to happen. The things we want to see happen are not going to happen unless we support organizations like PRI here, just as all those brilliant organizations around the world I saw at the Liberty Forum a couple of weeks ago. So thank you very much for being here and for supporting PRI. Okay, let me just talk then first about the midterms. I don't want you all to sigh at the sound of that. I know it's an easy it's an easy emotion to have, given the expectations and hopes that were built up and then the actual result. I don't want to go on and on about it, but I just want to pull out two things that I think really go to the heart of what happened. And it's two pieces of data, almost the same data but for two different things, that I think really tell you the whole story. So we all know about the results, the disappointment, the fact that the gains made by Republicans were pretty modest. And a lot of people on the other side have taken this as some kind of triumph, an endorsement of the Biden administration, its policies, both at the federal level, and Democrats around the country have taken it as an endorsement of the direction they're going in. But actually, if you look at the exit polls on election day, I guess we can't say election day anymore, it's election month or whatever it is, but you know, the polls that were taken after people voted, amazing. Despite all this, 70% of people, 70% of voters, that will include a huge number of Democrats, that's the math, thought, after they voted, that the country's going in the wrong direction. 70%. And 70%, roughly, in some of the polls, I've seen 60 this, let's say 70% I saw in one poll, do not want Biden to run for a second term. So here you have a situation where an overwhelming majority of the country thinks it's going in the wrong direction under Biden's leadership, and that he personally needs to stop as soon as he can, certainly not run for a second term. And yet, many people voted Democrat, who you wouldn't have imagined. Many of those same people voted for the Democrats. How did that happen? What is this conundrum? And I think actually, although there's been a lot of soul-searching about various aspects of that, I think it comes down to something that I really know very well from my past life in politics, and I've run and fought a lot of campaigns in a lot of countries. And there's a very simple lesson, which is, if you have a record that is terrible, that you can't run on, and if you have a leader who is unpopular, there's really only one thing you can do, and that is negative campaigning about the other side. And we perhaps didn't notice it at the time because some of the negative campaigning from the Democrats was so ludicrous, so offensive in many ways. All that stuff about democracy dying if Republicans win. It was so over the top, so ridiculous, laughable really. We probably didn't take it seriously. But actually, it was very organized, they were very consistent about it, very clear about the message. They all said the same thing over and over again, the same ludicrous thing over and over again, but they said it, and it had an effect. Enough people believed it. And you can say the same about their message on, what was the other big thing they talked about all the time? Abortion. Sorry, that seemed to me the two things that you ever heard from them. Abortion, death of democracy. Abortion, end of democracy, insurrection, all that stuff. That's all they did. But there's a lesson there, actually. The Republicans, in my view, didn't do enough to counter that from a campaigning point of view. I don't think that we should sit here in the wake of these midterm elections and question the basic ideas that we believe in, or the policies that we're trying to push forward, because those exit polls show that people do think the country's going in the wrong direction. They do want a change. It's just that when presented with the choice between Democrat and Republican, too many of them believed the incredibly aggressive but effective negative campaigning from the Democrats. That's, to me, the most important lesson. And so what it means is keep going in the direction of challenging all the things that the Democrats have done to take this country to the far left. People don't want it. They don't want the extremism. They don't want the extremism on the economy. They don't want the war on energy. They don't want the woke madness in our schools or anywhere else. They don't want this stuff. They know we're going in the wrong direction. But the Republicans have to offer, one, a more attractive alternative, and two, and this is the important point, don't just sit and take it when the Democrats launch these attacks. Fight back. One of my earlier jobs in politics was working for a great man, two great brothers actually, and they started an advertising agency that became the biggest in the world. British guys, their background was, they were from Iraq, became incredibly well known in the UK, Saatchi and Saatchi, Morris Saatchi and Charles Saatchi, I know them very well, and they had a very clear principle when it came to elections, and certainly in the campaigning part, not the policy part or the ideas part, absolutely the foundation, just the campaigning part, which is hit first, hit hard, keep on hitting. And we didn't do that. We didn't do that. We thought that it would be enough just to point to the Democrats' appalling record, just the damage they've done in 2 years to this country. We thought that would be enough. But it's not enough. In an election, people pay attention to these messages, and I think that is one thing that's really important for Republicans to bear in mind going forward. Quickly on the UK. Well, there is a place that's also going in the wrong direction. I think we can all safely agree. And the most depressing thing about that is it's not just the country going in the wrong direction, it's the Conservative Party going in the wrong direction. And it pains me to say that because, of course, that's where I once worked. I was very proud to be part of the Conservative Party in the UK and to be the senior advisor to David Cameron when he was leader of the opposition and subsequently in 10 Downing Street. But it seems to me that they've completely lost their way. And that really explains the mess of the last few years, particularly the last few months. Again, I'm very happy afterwards, of course, to engage in any of your questions, and you may have specific things that you'd like to follow up on. But I think it goes back to one simple thing. Not that simple, actually, but it's a simple word to say: Brexit. I was very much in favour of Brexit. I've always argued, I had always argued before Brexit that it was time to leave the European Union. The European Union, you can tell by the name changes. If you look at the way the European Union changed its name over the years, when it was founded, it was the European Coal and Steel Community. Then it became the European Economic Community. Then they changed it to the European Community, and then they changed it to the European Union. And you see in that progression what's been going on. This move towards a centralized, what they call a federal Europe, but really that meant more and more control passing to unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. And people say, well, that's not true. When you look at the three parts, there's a kind of constitutional arrangement for the European Union, which has basically three branches of government. The European Council, which is the meetings of the prime ministers of each country, and when it's health policy, the health ministers, and when it's crime policy, the Home Office or Justice ministers, and so on. That's the European Council. You have the European Parliament. The European Parliament is directly elected. So you've got two parts of the setup there, you could say, democratic, right? Because the prime ministers who show up to the meetings of the European Council, they're elected, and the European Parliament is elected. What's the problem? Well, the third branch is the problem. That's the European Commission. Those are the unelected, appointed bureaucrats. That's the bureaucracy that drives the EU. And there's a very important wrinkle in this constitutional setup, which is that the power to initiate policy, guess where that resides? The European Commission, the bureaucracy. They're the ones that get the ball rolling on any policy initiative. And then by the time it becomes an initiative that then has to be voted on and debated, what else have they done? They've moved to something when with the expansion of the European Union to have whatever it is now, 27 countries, I don't know if that's including the UK or not, nearly 30 countries, too many to have unanimity, so you have to have majority views, so they call it qualified majority voting, where each country's voting is weighted and you get a consensus and so on. In other words, you can't stop anything. That's basically what that means. No country can stop anything. There's no power of veto. And so what you actually end up doing is what actually ends up happening is that the elected people are presented over and over again in every area of policy with these proposals generated by the bureaucracy that they then have to deal with. None of it is driven by the actual wishes of the citizens of any of the member states. It's all the bureaucracy. And then you can't stop anything, so it ends up being this horse trading, where you say, well, here's something we really hate, but here's something we hate, but not quite as much. So we'll agree to that thing we hate in order to stop the thing we really hate. That's basically how it works. And so that's what led me over the years, particularly once I started working in 10 Downing Street, when I did I asked the civil servants to do an analysis of actually, where is all this policy that we were implementing as a UK government that I didn't know about, and the Prime Minister didn't know about, and we hear it announced on the radio in the morning. Where does it all come from? Well, it turned out that 70% was either driven by the bureaucracy in the UK or implementing the bureaucratic initiatives of the EU. 70% of what we do. That's not an estimate. There's a lot of 70% numbers I've now realized in today's talk. But the 70% in terms of the policy, that was an audit of what we were doing over a 3-month period in the UK by the officials. 70% of the activity of the UK government was not generated by the elected government. So, I was very clear we had to leave the EU, and in order to deal with this, and to actually reclaim control, take back control was the slogan. Brexit passed, much to everyone's surprise. Not mine, but the media's, the establishment surprise. And then what happened? they spent years messing it up and failing to implement it. You had Theresa May making a mess of it for years before she was kicked out. Then you had Boris Johnson come in. He was going to sort it all out. He won a huge majority, promising to, quote, get Brexit done. But they didn't. They didn't get Brexit done. They technically left the European Union, but what they didn't get done was the whole point of Brexit, which was to reduce the bureaucracy and the regulation and the taxes and all the things that were holding the UK back. And that, I think, explains the current mess that the UK is in, because it's still this roiling trauma, Brexit. Still, what is it now? 6 years on. More than 6 years on from the actual vote. They're still arguing about it. And people say it's failed, and other people's, and my reaction is, you haven't done it yet. You literally haven't done it. 6 years on, you haven't done it. You haven't cut the regulations. You haven't cut the bureaucracy. Haven't done any of that. And so that led to the terrible situation that the UK has experienced in the last few months, where you had someone elected by the Conservative Party, Liz Truss, who actually did have a clear vision, a free market vision, I would say, that I thought was pretty much completely correct. That actually the only way for the UK to succeed in a post-Brexit world is to be the best place in the world, certainly the best place in Europe, to start and run a business. You'd attract investment. It would be pro-democracy, pro-freedom, all the things that all the principles we believe in here, to be a shining example of that, going back to some of the leadership that Mrs. Thatcher showed, which made Britain such a great success story, turned around Britain's fortunes in the 1980s. And by the way, where did she learn all that? Going back to the importance of organisations like the PRI, Margaret Thatcher literally learned all of that at the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, founded by my grandfather-in-law, Anthony Fisher. He founded that organisation. That incubated the ideas that led to the Thatcher Revolution. Liz Truss, same. She spent her time there. When she became Prime Minister, it was widely reported in the press, she is someone who believes and has supported and been part of the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. So you'd think, great, finally there's someone who really believes in this, is going to make it happen. But there's another lesson, going back to my point about campaigning. It's not enough to have the right ideas. It's not enough to have the right policies. That's not enough in politics and government. When it comes to winning elections, you've got to have the best campaign as well, including what you say about your opposition and the potential consequences if they win. You've got to get that part right. It's not enough to comfort yourself with knowing you're right. You have to prove to the electorate that the other side are wrong and will be wrong in the future. So you've got to have good campaigning. When you're in government, you also need, as well as the right ideas and the right policies, which I believe Liz Truss had, you've got to have proper professional preparation and a plan for implementation, and you've got to have good communication to explain what you're doing. Mrs. Thatcher had all of that. Very famously, to pick just one example, when one of the things that Mrs. Thatcher is most known for is breaking the power of the unions. The unions had a stranglehold on the British economy through the 1970s. The unions were the number one reason Britain was failing as a country. She knew it was the number one thing she had to deal with. And the most powerful of all of the unions were the mine workers. Much of the energy system depended on coal. They had a stranglehold on the country. The mine workers mining the coal that kept the country going. They were the most powerful union, the most militant union, the most far-left union. She knew she had to beat them. They went on strike soon after she took office as Prime Minister. What did she do? She basically gave in to all of their demands. Why? Because she knew that at that point she couldn't win a strike against the mine workers who would hold the country to ransom by basically turning the lights out. Instead, she hired Nigel Lawson, who subsequently went on to be an amazingly dramatic reformer of taxes when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. She hired him as Energy Minister and said, you need to get us into a position where we can win a miners' strike. So he spent years building up supplies of coal, enough to last a year, building up the supplies, stockpiling coal. And then they provoked a fight with the mine workers. And the miners walked into the trap, and Mrs. Thatcher and her team knew, well, we can wait you out because we've got enough coal to keep the country going. She put in the preparation. And I'm afraid Liz Truss didn't do any of that. That's the reason that the plans just collapsed. It's not enough to have the right ideas. Turning to California. It's not enough to have the right ideas for California. We know we have the right ideas, and again I point to the evidence from the polls. People in California don't think we're going in the right direction. There's a majority here in California for change. I'm completely convinced of that. You talk to people everywhere. Not just conservatives, not just Republicans, not even just the independents who don't really care about politics very much. Democrats know how bad it is. Democrats. You talk to anyone in Los Angeles about what's going on there. You find people who've never voted Republican in their life, would never consider voting Republican right now. We can't go on like this. Look at the crime, look at the homelessness, everything out of control. Look at all the businesses fleeing the state, entrepreneurs starting elsewhere. I mean, look at the fiscal crisis that's about to happen because of that. Suddenly we go from this enormous surplus that Newsom is throwing around in these election bribes just a few weeks ago. Well, they're still calling them stimulus payments as if we're still in the pandemic. But now they tell us that we've got a deficit just around the corner. Why? Because the tax base is collapsing, because everybody's leaving. The higher paid businesses, it's collapsing. And we know the list of the problems, you know, from the wildfires to the ridiculous, insane energy policy, where we're stopping people from driving their cars, but we can't charge your electric car because there's no energy, because we've shut down California oil and gas production, even though it's cleaner, but instead we're going to import it on tankers from halfway across the world. The most polluting form of transportation in the world, these giant tankers shipping oil from wherever it is, from Saudi Arabia and Iran before the sanctions, and Ecuador. Unbelievable, you know, total madness, totally incoherent, and yet they preach to everyone about climate. So we know all the issues. Why did we see such a disappointing performance here in California in the elections just now? Why did we not see any progress really at the statewide level? Yes, we can point to some great results, particularly down here in Orange County. I'm sure you're very involved in those races. Fantastic results from Michelle Steele and Young Kim, Mike Garcia just a little bit further up the coast, Scott Board just here. I thought, what an amazing performance against Katie Porter. How close? No one would have imagined that would be so close. So at the congressional level, some great results. But statewide, a really disappointing outcome. I think, again, it comes to what I was saying earlier. It's the theme that goes through what I'm saying. I know that PRI is an organization devoted to ideas and policy. That's been my work in politics for years, for decades. But it's not enough. You need to have the right kind of campaigning and communication and so on. I think the big issue for the Republican Party here in California, and I hate to use a term that a lot of people dismiss when it comes to politics, they, oh, that's just marketing. That's not serious. It's the brand. The brand of the Republican Party means that people, even if they agree with everything we say about what the Democrats are doing to our beautiful state, even if they agree with us in terms of our policy solutions, they just can't bring themselves to vote Republican. And we saw that even a candidate as good as Lan Hee Chen, who positioned himself as the moderate, respectable, reasonable Republican, and so on, really didn't make much of a dent. So, we need to take that seriously. We've got to have the right ideas and the right policies here in California, but we also really need to understand that we need to turn around the perceptions of the brand of the Republican Party. And that is not going to happen overnight. And it's not about showing up 3 months before the election and saying, vote for me, look, I've got the great ideas. It is a long-term thing that we have to be engaged in and be aware that we have to persuade people that what they've heard about the Republican Party is often a lie. It's a false caricature. But that's the reality for a lot of people. So we have to work hard to overcome that. And so that's what I'm committed to doing. That's why I started the Daily California, the podcast. That's why I'm spending more of my time focused on what's going on here in our state and trying to turn it around. Because exactly as was mentioned earlier, I'm not leaving, I'm staying, I'm fighting. I think that with the right approach over the next 4 or 5 years, we will turn things around, because in the end, you can't push people as far as they've been pushed here in California to the far left before people say, that's enough. We've had enough of this. We want a change. We need to be ready at that moment with an attractive alternative that makes people feel good about voting Republican, and I'm absolutely confident that we can do it. I'll stop there, Sally. Maybe we can do some questions together. Great to see you all. Thank you.
Well, I think you've generated a lot of enthusiasm and excitement and questions from the audience. So, well, you're the first person with your hand up.
I love what you said. I agree with all of it. I think that the challenge that I'm trying to figure out that we do is the media bias that we have. And so the avenue in getting our message out seems to be a big issue.
Shall I go for that one? Yes, okay, so you're talking about California specifically. Yes, I completely agree, and so I'm going to be very blunt about that. That's not going to change. We're not going to suddenly turn all the local NPR stations to sort of fair-minded organizations are going to take our message and take it seriously and so on, and the newspaper, the LA Times and so on. We know all that. And so what it means is being really serious about the fact that this is going to take a lot of money, because we need to raise a lot of money to get behind a message and candidates that will actually, over the long term, show people that this is not the same Republican Party you think it is. It's not the Republican Party that you've been told it is by the media, misinformed. And that's why I think it's a caricature. I don't think it's real. But they do think, I mean, if you go through the thing, you can look at the surveys. What do they think about the Republican Party? They think it's for the rich, and it's for it's racist, and all these things. Homophobic, doesn't care about the environment, on and on. And so that's not true. We do care about the environment. We do care about conservation. We just know the right way to do it is not this endless top-down regulation that you see what I mean? And every one of those issues, we've got a good story to tell, but you've got to be, it will take money. That is the short answer to your question. Whoever's doing this has to raise an enormous amount of money to overcome that media bias. That is just the truth.
Question. You mentioned that the Democratic Party had two messages that they pounded on. So what would be your recommendation today for the two messages that the Republican Party should be pounding?
Here in California, or
Right here in California.
well, I think I'll be very just to go into that specifically. I think you need that combination of positive and negative in a campaign, and because the Democrats had nothing positive to say, they only had those negative messages. Now, unfortunately, because we're not in power in California, Republicans don't have a record, good or bad. We haven't been in power for so long. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I mean, people think you focus on the governorship, which is now, what is it, a decade since you had a Republican, just over a decade. But that's right, with Schwarzenegger. But actually, if you look at remember, most of the policies that really do the damage actually emanate from the legislature. And Democrats have had total control of both chambers in the legislature for 25 years. 25 years, a quarter of a century, since 1997. They're the ones with the record. We're the ones with the ideas to change it. So I think that we have that ability to be both positive and to critique the Democrats. Now, when you come to the messages that critique the Democrats, my advice would be, don't just go on and on about how bad things are. People know that. Project it forward. What are the consequences for the future of keeping the Democrats in power? So I would look at things like the crime and the homelessness, which I think because they just underpin what's gone wrong in California so much, and also the taxes. I think crime and homelessness is one issue, the collapse of the quality of life for so many people, but also the taxes. And say, look, if they keep going like this, your taxes will go up by a certain amount. Be really specific. So I think with the forward, it needs to be a forward-looking message about the consequences of Democrat rule continuing. In terms of the Republican message, again, I think you've got to be realistic about what people are feeling. And I think right now, if the campaign was now, I think it does need to be focused on those issues, on the sort of intersection of crime, homelessness, drug addiction. I would really recommend you. I'm not here just to pitch my stuff, but I taped a really, really informative episode of my podcast podcast this week. I think we put it out on Monday with someone, Leighton Woodhouse. He works very closely with Michael Schellenberger, who I'm sure many of you know, and it was just an incredibly valuable deep dive into that issue of why it is that they spend billions and billions and billions of dollars year after year on tackling homelessness, and the problem seems to get worse. Not seems to, does get worse. And he answered that question, basically, and it's because of the policies, the laws that have been passed that mean that they won't deal with the drug addiction that's at the heart of it. So I think that's the number one thing right now. In 4 years, maybe something different. But right now, I'd say, here's our solution to this problem that is destroying the quality of life in so many parts of the state. And here's what will happen if the Democrats keep going. It'll just get worse.
Sheila and then Kathy.
I have a question, and not to stay on the election kind of thing, but the Democrats always consolidate their message down to very emotional points. Republicans don't really ever come across as emotional. They win on those emotional points. A lot of young people took that message about abortion, and made it a single issue election.
I think you're completely right. And it's a very important point, because actually if you look at you asked the question, who's voting? I think, did you mean across the country, who's voting? Yeah, that's part of your question.
Yes.
Yeah, so one thing that was I should have mentioned this, and thank you again for prompting me. That one thing that was notable about this midterm election was a really, really unusually high turnout among younger people. It kind of matched, I think I'm right in saying, that what you typically see in a general election for the young people, and that was driven by that message. So again, it was very effective, and I agree with you, it needs to be emotional, and that's often, I remember, again, going back to the Saatchi days, they were, one of their things that the Saatchi brothers were particularly obsessed about was boiling things down to their essence, making things very simple. And there was a term that they used about, it's not an exact analogy, Conservative Party in the UK, Republicans here, Democrats here, Labour Party, but it'll do. And let me just make sure I get this right. So he said, well, the truth is, if you look at these parties' brands in the UK, Conservatives are cruel but efficient, and Labour are caring but incompetent. And said, actually, we can kind of win that. That's enough. In the end, that's enough to win elections. And don't be too greedy. He would say, don't be too greedy. Don't try and be seen as everything perfect. Because efficient and caring and everything. Cruel but efficient. Well, look, I think that's what he said. I think that actually, the truth is that, particularly, I think it's even a more emotional age, and with the social media and all the rest of it, everyone's sort of emoting all over the place all the time, and virtue signaling, as we know. And so I think you do need to try and do both, actually. That's what he said back then, that was years ago. I think that you've got to try and show that you to show that emotion and the warmth that attracts people. I think that's right, particularly here in California.
Kathy.
So you're the first person I've ever heard give a talk who said what I've been saying to the Lincoln Club, an organization I've been a member of for 20 years, and that is, we are not fleet of foot. We know early on what their message was, abortion democracy, and we did nothing. I was told by several leaders in the Lincoln Club that, well, we don't have their funds, that's not. If we don't have their funds this time, we damn well better have them next time, because we know what they're going to do. And then the second thing is, I've had a mantra for the 20 years, and that is, the message needs to be dumbed down and made emotional, as Sheila was saying. Dumb it down and make it emotional. That's how they win. Their argument for both abortion and democracy was stupid, and it was emotional.
Yes.
Both of them were stupid and emotional. So I'd love to have you come so that there's an authoritative voice saying what I've been saying for 20 years.
Great. Well, no, thank you very much. It's always always great to see a like-minded person. I totally agree, and I think you put it very well. And that's right. And it's no use being all kind of, oh well, we just have our clever policies and that's all you need. No. Yeah. And the thing I keep coming back to, I've probably said it 3 times now. It's not enough, particularly when you're in opposition and you're trying to win, which is our situation in California. It's not enough enough to keep going on about how bad things are, because elections are about the future. And so the message about the opponents, it's not, I mean, we can go on and on about how bad things are and the homeless and the crime, how will it be worse? What's going to happen in the future? Because they're out there with a message saying Republicans are going to make it worse. So if the only people talking about the future in negative terms are the Democrats, then we lose. You've got to say, no, it's not just, it's going to get worse if these people have another 4 years in Sacramento or whatever.
California's going to get worse if we don't turn the
exactly. And
people on the dole upside down. That's what
absolutely right. That's exactly right. And that whole culture is just very, very, is deeply worrying, actually. I mean, there's so many things to say, but I think that if you look at the incredible, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me about California, given the fact that we're such a big and important state, I mean, just on the numbers, I think just overtaken the UK to be the fourth largest economy. I mean, I know that's disputed, but I quite like that now. I'm here in California. I'll take it as a win. Yes, exactly. So the unbelievable lack of scrutiny and accountability for the governance of this state is amazing. If you just look at the total incompetence, I mean, just and corruption. It's absolutely out and out corruption. Again, a story. Where were you? Susan Shelley from. I'm trying to find our friend from the Orange County Register. Here we are, right south, right here, exactly. Susan Shelley, and the Southern, I always get it wrong, Southern News Group, Southern California News Group. So Susan Shelley, who writes for the Southern California News Group, particularly Orange County Register, joins me on the podcast most Tuesdays. She just unearthed this amazing story about how a no-bid contract under the emergency rule of Gavin Newsom was handed out to a Democrat political consulting firm to try and get people to get their vaccines. And this is a firm that literally does phone banking, getting people to vote Democrat. It's pure politics. That's what they do. They were hired to get people to do the vaccine, no bid contract, handing out the money, our money, to a political crony. And then halfway through the contract, they change it to say, we're now going to give you the vaccine register, the health information of every Californian. They actually hand it over to a political consulting firm, and then they sort of tack on this little addendum about, oh, now that means you're a HIPAA partner, which means you have to do all the HIPAA stuff. They don't know anything about the HIPAA stuff. The HIPAA requirements are incredibly arduous for very good reasons. Who thinks they're actually doing that? Totally corrupt. A total shambles. That's just like one tiny little thing. And it's happening right across the governance of California. There's no scrutiny, the media, I mean, it's just, I think that, we've got a lot of ingredients to put together to a strong message. But I think so far no one has really kind of boiled it down in the way you described and made it emotional in the way you described.
So that, no, the chap next to Bob, sorry, you had your hand up before, yes.
Yeah, it seems that the media in California has focused, particularly during the Los Angeles mayoral campaign, on the significance of housing being the cause for homelessness, when you're saying that that's really not the issue, and it doesn't seem to be the issue, but everything we read about from both sides of that particular race was all about housing.
Yeah, exactly.
Housing is just a way for development.
No, exactly right. I mean, no wonder Rick Caruso wants to talk about housing and construction. Look, the thing is that I think that they're two separate issues, and it's not just me. I mean, it's anyone who studied it. So the homelessness issue, the street homelessness, is almost entirely a drug addiction. It's an untreated drug addiction and mental health crisis. And we know how to deal with that. I mean, just to give you one specific example, and this is all in the podcast, I really recommend, honestly, I don't want to keep going on about it, but if there's one thing you listen to, that I learned so much, and I study this stuff, and I've talked to Schellenberger over there, I found it so informative, this conversation on my podcast, The Daily California, this week. But there's one specific thing I didn't know, which is there's this 2016 law, state law, that means that state funds cannot go to any organization that promotes abstinence from drugs. Can't go, it's illegal. So all of the money from the state, all of it, is going to organizations that believe in what's called harm reduction, which means keeping people on drugs. All of the money. That's a law. So that's just one example. So the homelessness situation, I mean, it's not unrelated to housing, because I'll give you one example. It is true that certain people will find themselves in financial difficulty. Maybe they lose their job or whatever, can't afford their rent, they go on a slippery slope, end up, couch surfing for a bit, and then that comes to the end of its natural life, and then they may end up, sadly, sleeping in a car, then they can't afford the car payment, and then they go down the slippery slope. But even then, so they don't enter the world of homelessness as drug addicts, but pretty much the minute they're on the street, they become drug addicts, because that's the currency of the street. And so drug addiction is the problem. Of course, that connects with the crime problem, because you've got crime gangs running the drugs. So that's homelessness. Housing actually is a problem in California, but it's a different problem. It's a problem of affordability. It's a problem of young people being able to get on the housing ladder, what our communities look and feel like, and so on. And actually, it's exactly what you said. I think the problem there is also corruption, because basically a combination of the zoning laws and the way that things work on a city and county level mean that the only people that end up being able to build anything are massive developers who are putting money into the pockets of the politicians. And so you end up with this, escalation in land value and price, because they hoard the land. I mean, it's a really complicated situation, but again, the poor regulation and the corruption of the system is what we need to address there, to make housing affordable. But that won't help homelessness unless you deal with the drug problem. But sorry, to the point about why they keep going on about it is because
focus the emphasis on the drugs and not the housing.
Well, you have to. It's a great question, and I'm thinking about that question actually very actively. For example, maybe one way of doing that would be for someone to sponsor and lead. Well, I'm going to sort of preface this a bit. So what we have in California, we have the ability to run ballot initiatives, as you know. The kind of theoretical, now a lot of them have ended up with terrible policy outcomes, voting for spending without the tax, so I'm not, but it is what it is. We have this mechanism. One of the theoretical arguments in favor of the ballot mechanism, the ballot initiative mechanism, is that it enables the people to overcome the institutional barriers of the political system. So this is a classic example where you have this supermajority in the legislature who are behind this madness about keeping people on drugs, because there's a whole, as my guest in the podcast said, homeless industrial complex. So many people benefit from it. So they're not going to change it. It's not going to change in the legislature. So actually, it really is a classic example where a ballot initiative might well be the answer. Because you could overturn the law, that particular law, with a ballot initiative. Now that would really focus attention. I'm not saying I'll do it or whatever. It's just an example. I'm giving you a specific example of the kind of thing that might elevate it. And then the minute you have something focused on that, people go, well, why are you doing that? What's that? And it prompts the debate. So it is one of those things where I think exactly right. It needs to be lifted up and people can focus on it so that we get beyond this platitude that I'll build more houses and we'll deal with homelessness.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.